Okay guys, so in this video I want to talk about the inefficiency of monopoly, and when we have a monopoly, what happens to the quantity as well as the price in our market. Okay, so first let's just start off with perfect competition, right? So here we have our equilibrium quantity sold, right? So I just label that as QC, which is our competitive equilibrium quantity, and then we have our PC, which is our competitive equilibrium price. Okay, and we know that when we're in equilibrium, in perfect competition, our surplus is maximized, right? Our total economic surplus is maximized. So this triangle here gives us our consumer surplus, and then this bottom triangle here gives us our producer surplus, right? So both these together are maximized. Okay, so now let's assume we now have a monopoly. Okay, so what happens under a monopoly, first of all, is that their supply actually is just their marginal cost, right? Whatever is their marginal cost, whatever their additional cost of production is, that is going to be their supply curve. Okay, so if the industry becomes a monopoly, then the supply curve becomes the monopolist's marginal cost curve. Okay, and then what happens is we now have the monopoly, right? The monopolist's marginal revenue. Okay, so suppose the marginal revenue looks something like this, a straight line going downwards. So here we have the marginal revenue. Okay, and what do we know is true? Well, if we recall from class, the monopolist is actually only going to produce up until the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, right? Recall the rule that we continue to use, right? So the rule is marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, so that's exactly what the monopolist is going to do. So the monopolist is only going to produce up until the point where the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue. So if that's the case, then how much are they producing? Well, they're only producing this quantity that now I'm going to denote as QM. Okay, so notice what happens to the quantity produced. Well, the quantity produced falls, right? It falls to the left. So the monopolist reduces output to the level at which marginal revenue is now equal to marginal cost. And now what does this do to price, right? Well, to find the price, we need to figure out at what point this intersects the demand curve. Well, it intersects the demand curve at this point here, right? So what's the price? The corresponding value on the y-axis is here, this PM, okay? So PM is the price under the monopoly, okay? So what the monopolist is essentially doing is they're going to reduce production to the point where their marginal revenue is equal to their marginal cost, and essentially what this does is now it's also going to drive up the price. Okay, so less of the good or service is being sold, and at a much higher price than what we had in the competitive equilibrium, right? So what happens is price goes up and the quantity goes down. Okay, that's sort of, to sum it up, that's kind of what happens. Okay, but now what about efficiency, right? What happens to efficiency loss? Is there loss or is there gain, right? What's going on here? Well, our consumer surplus before, remember, was just this entire triangle, right? That was our consumer surplus before. But now, if this is the price, then our consumer surplus has just been reduced to this smaller triangle here, right? And this value, this rectangle, this is transferred in surplus to the monopoly, right? To the firm that is the monopolist. And then we're going to have deadweight loss as this triangle right here. Okay, so let's break each of these down one by one. Okay, so first let's talk about the consumer surplus. Okay, so what's going on with the consumer surplus? Well, if the price has now increased from here to this value, right? Well, these consumers can no longer purchase this product, right? Their willingness to pay is too low. It's much lower than the price that is being set because of this monopoly. But these folk here, they can still buy, right? So because these folk here can still buy, right, recall that the surplus is just each individual's willingness to pay minus the price. Well, all we're going to do is we're just going to take all these individuals here and we're just going to find the area of this triangle, right? So the area of this triangle is our new consumer surplus, and notice that it's actually much smaller than the triangle that we had before. Okay, so we know for a fact that consumer surplus is going to go down. Okay, so first let's actually just highlight this area, or let's actually just use some colored here. So this area is our new reduced consumer surplus. Okay, it's our new consumer surplus. Okay, but what about this area here, right? What about this rectangle here? Well, this rectangle is just the surplus that is being transferred to the monopolist, right? So this is surplus that is being transferred to monopolist, right? Because the monopolist is now charging that higher price. Okay, so that rectangle is going to be the that which is transferred to the monopolist. Okay, and now finally we're going to have our deadweight loss. Okay, well, notice what happens, right? Notice what happens is that these consumers, right? These consumers are no longer purchasing this product. Okay, we don't really care too much about the consumers that were down here, as sad as that sounds, because they were not in the market to begin with, right? They were not making any transaction, even when we were in perfect competition, right? Even when we were in equilibrium, they were not making any sort of transaction, so they were not really in the market to begin with. But these individuals were, and because these individuals can no longer purchase their this product, right? The surplus that was initially part of the consumers, right? The consumer surplus, this is now lost, right? Because these individuals have now dropped out of the market. Okay, so that's the loss on the producer side. So we have deadweight loss here, but then what about over here? Well, this is also going to be deadweight loss. The reason being because the firm is not producing that quantity, right? The firm is not producing the quantity from here to here, right? And because that's no longer being produced, that is also efficiency loss. Okay, because we are straying from what the market efficient outcome was. Okay, so this triangle, right? This whole triangle, both of these added together, that becomes our total deadweight loss. Okay, and that is basically the burden that that this monopoly is imposing on the market, right? That is our efficiency loss. Okay, so this is generating now some sort of inefficiency. Okay, so this is our inefficiency. Okay, so that's how we want to figure out what happens to efficiency, both on the consumer side, right? What happens to consumer surplus? How much is transferred to the producer, right? In this case, there are not multiple producers. There is only one producer, and that one producer is the monopolist. And we also can now figure out what happens to this loss surplus, right? We now have some sort of deadweight loss. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful.